At 2:47 in the afternoon on April 11th, 1945, Machinist's mate second class Anthony Tony DiMarco was welding a seam on frame 123 of the destroyer USS Laffey when he heard the general quarters alarm. He dropped his torch, grabbed his helmet, and ran toward his battle station. Behind him, the weld bead he'd just laid looked wrong. The pattern was irregular, almost chaotic, nothing like what the Navy manual specified. His supervisor had yelled at him about it twice that morning. DiMarco didn't care. He'd been doing it his way for 6 months, and he wasn't going to stop now. The Laffey was stationed on radar picket duty 16 miles north of Okinawa. Radar picket ships were the early warning system for the invasion fleet, positioned in a circle around the island to detect incoming Japanese aircraft before they could reach the main body of ships. It was the most dangerous assignment in the Navy. The Japanese knew where the picket ships were. They were alone, exposed, easy targets for the Kamikaze corps that was throwing everything Japan had left at the American fleet. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. DiMarco was 23 years old from South Philadelphia. He'd worked in the shipyards before enlisting, learned welding from his father who'd built Liberty ships during the early war years. His father taught him the standard techniques: straight beads, consistent heat, uniform penetration. Navy specifications demanded precision. Every weld had to look identical, meet exact standards, pass rigorous inspection. That's how you built ships that wouldn't fall apart under stress. But DiMarco had noticed something during his time in the Philadelphia yards. The ships that came back damaged, the ones that survived torpedo hits or collisions or storms, they didn't fail at the welds that looked perfect. They failed at the welds that looked perfect but had hidden flaws. Porosity, incomplete fusion, stress concentrations where the metal cooled too uniformly. The problem was that perfect-looking welds were often brittle. They looked good on inspection, but under extreme stress they could crack catastrophically. DiMarco started experimenting. He varied his torch angle slightly. He adjusted his travel speed mid-bead. He let the weld pool cool unevenly in specific patterns. The result was welds that looked rough, almost amateur, but the metal structure was different. The irregular cooling created what metallurgists would later call a favorable grain structure. The slight variations in penetration created redundancy. If one section started to crack, the crack would hit a boundary where the metal properties changed slightly and the crack propagation would slow or stop. His supervisors hated it. The welds looked sloppy. They didn't meet the visual standards in Navy welding manuals. DiMarco got written up 3 times. He was nearly reassigned to deck division. But the welds passed X-ray inspection. They passed dye-penetrant testing. They met strength requirements, so the Navy let him keep welding, even though every seam he laid looked wrong. The Laffey had been commissioned in February of 1944 at Bath Iron Works in Maine. She was an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer, 376 feet long, 40 feet at the beam, displacing 2,200 tons at full load. She was armed with 6 5-inch 38 caliber guns in 3 twin mounts, 12 40mm anti-aircraft guns, 11 20mm cannons, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, and depth charge racks. Her crew numbered 330 men. The Sumner class was an improvement over earlier destroyers. Stronger hull, better anti-aircraft armament, more sophisticated fire control systems. They were designed specifically to counter the air threat that had devastated so many ships in the Pacific. But no destroyer could survive a direct hit from an aircraft loaded with bombs and fuel traveling at 400 miles per hour. The kinetic energy alone was devastating. The explosion that followed was catastrophic. Destroyers hit by kamikazes typically sank or were scrapped. The damage was too severe to repair. Commander Frederick Julian Beckton commanded the Laffey. He was 40 years old from Greenville, Texas, Naval Academy class of 1926. He'd commanded the destroyer Aaron Ward until she was sunk by a Japanese dive bomber in April of 1943. Beckton had survived, spent months recovering from injuries, then requested another destroyer command. The Navy gave him Laffey. Beckton trained his crew relentlessly. He drilled them on damage control until they could fight fires and seal compartments in complete darkness. He practiced anti-aircraft tracking until the gun crews could hit sleeves towed by friendly aircraft at maximum range. He ran man-overboard drills, collision drills, flooding drills. He pushed the engineering department to maintain maximum readiness. He wanted every system functioning at 100% when the shooting started. By April of 1945, the crew was as prepared as any destroyer crew could be. They'd been through the invasion of Iwo Jima, providing fire support and anti-aircraft coverage. They'd shot down 3 Japanese aircraft. They'd bombarded shore installations. They knew their jobs. But nothing could fully prepare them for what was coming. The battle for Okinawa had begun on April 1st, 1945. It was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. Over 1,500 ships, more than 540,000 personnel. The island was only 350 miles from mainland Japan. Taking Okinawa would give the United States airfields close enough to support an invasion of the Japanese home islands. Japan knew this. They understood that losing Okinawa meant losing the war. The Japanese response was Operation 10 Go, a massive kamikaze offensive. They were going to throw every available aircraft at the American fleet. Trained pilots, partially trained pilots, volunteers with barely 20 hours of flight time. It didn't matter. They just needed to get the plane to the target and crash it into American ships. No bombs to drop, no torpedoes to aim, no return trip to plan. Just fly until you hit something. The first major kamikaze attack, called Kikusui 1, hit on April 6th. Over 700 aircraft. The radar picket destroyers took the brunt of it. USS Bush was hit by 3 kamikazes and sank. USS Colquhoun was hit by 4 kamikazes and had to be scuttled. USS Emmons was hit by 5 kamikazes and sank. In one day, the Navy lost multiple destroyers and hundreds of sailors to an enemy that couldn't be deterred because they were already dead the moment they took off. The Laffey had survived Kikusui 1. She'd been in port for maintenance. Now, 5 days later, she was on radar picket station number 1, the most exposed position, the first place the kamikazes would hit. With her were 2 support landing craft, LCS-51 and LCS-116, small ships with 40mm guns to help with anti-aircraft defense. That was it. 3 ships alone 16 miles north of the fleet. When DiMarco reached his battle station at Mount 53, the aft 5-inch gun, he could see aircraft on the horizon. A lot of aircraft, coming from the north. The ship's radar had counted them, 22 bogies inbound, then the count updated. 50 bogies. Then it stopped counting. There were too many. The first kamikaze came in at 2:48, a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, a Japanese army fighter. It dove from 8,000 feet directly at the Laffey's bridge. Every gun on the ship that could bear opened fire. The 5-inch guns, the 40mm, the 20s, tracers filled the sky. The Oscar shuddered under the hits, pieces flying off the wings and fuselage, but the pilot kept coming. At 300 feet, the Oscar was burning. At 100 feet, it was disintegrating, but it still had momentum. The aircraft hit the Laffey's starboard side just below the waterline at the stern. The impact punched through the hull plating. The explosion from the Oscar's remaining fuel and ammunition blew a hole 10 feet across. Water poured into the after-engine room. DiMarco felt the hit. The whole ship shuddered. Damage control parties were already running aft. The engineering officer was shouting reports. Flooding in compartment A307. Pumps activated. Watertight doors sealed. The Laffey kept steaming. 1 hit, 21 more aircraft still coming. The second kamikaze arrived 40 seconds later, an Aichi D-3 Aval dive bomber. It came in from the port side, aiming for the forward gun mounts. The Laffey's guns tracked it, firing continuously. The Val took hits across its sucker, engine, cowling and wings. It started smoking, but the pilot adjusted his dive and kept coming. The aircraft crashed into the port side amidships, hitting between the 2 forward 5-inch gun mounts. The explosion was massive. The Val was carrying a 500-pound bomb that detonated on impact. The blast tore through the superstructure, destroyed the radio room, killed everyone in the pilot house, and started fires across the forward deck. Commander Beckton was thrown across the bridge. His helmet was knocked off. Blood was running down his face from a gash above his eye. But he got up, grabbed a sound-powered phone, and started giving orders. He was still in command. Mount 51, the forward 5-inch gun on the port side, was destroyed. The crew was dead. Mount 52, the forward gun on the starboard side, was damaged but still operational. The crew kept firing. DiMarco's Mount 53, the aft gun, was still untouched. He could see the barrel elevated, tracking another incoming aircraft. The third Kamikaze was already diving. Another Val. This one came in from astern, low over the water, trying to avoid the concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The 20mm guns on the fantail engaged it. The gunners were firing so fast the barrels were glowing red. The Val took hits but didn't slow down. It crashed into the stern at the waterline, right next to where the first Oscar had hit minutes earlier. The explosion blew another hole in the hull. More flooding. The stern was settling lower in the water. The damage control parties were overwhelmed. They couldn't seal all the leaks. Water was rising in 3 compartments. The pumps were running at maximum capacity, but it wasn't enough. The Laffey was taking on water faster than the pumps could remove it. Commander Beckton ordered the forward magazines flooded to prevent explosions if fire reached them. He ordered counter-flooding on the starboard side to correct the list developing to port. He ordered maximum speed to maintain steerage. If the Laffey lost propulsion, she was finished. The ship had to keep moving to maneuver, to present a harder target, to give the guns clear fields of fire. The fourth Kamikaze came in at 2:51, a Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter. It targeted the bridge, trying to kill the command staff. The 40mm guns engaged it at 2,000 yards. They hit it repeatedly. The Zero's engine started trailing smoke. One wing caught fire. But the pilot kept the aircraft under control. He was committed. He was going to hit something. At 500 yards, the Zero was fully engulfed in flames. At 200 yards, pieces were falling off. At 50 yards, it was barely recognizable as an aircraft, but it still had velocity. It still had mass. And it still hit the Laffey. The Zero crashed into the bridge structure on the starboard side. The impact killed everyone on the starboard bridge wing. The explosion from the remaining fuel started more fires. The navigation equipment was destroyed. The radar was knocked out. Communications were failing. But Commander Beckton was still alive, still giving orders, still fighting his ship. DiMarco's gun mount continued firing. Mount 53 was one of the few weapons still fully operational. The crew was loading and firing as fast as physically possible. The gun was so hot the paint was burning off the barrel. The powder cases were piling up so fast the crew had to kick them out of the way to keep working. The fifth Kamikaze dove at 2:53, another Oscar. This one came in from the port quarter, diving at a steep angle. The remaining operational guns engaged it. The Oscar took multiple hits. One wing separated from the fuselage. The aircraft started tumbling, but its momentum carried it forward. It crashed into the port side midships, hitting just above the waterline. The explosion blew a 15-foot hole in the hull. More flooding, more fires, more casualties. The Laffey was being torn apart piece by piece, but she was still afloat, still fighting, still moving. The sixth Kamikaze arrived 20 seconds later, a Val dive bomber loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb. It came almost vertically down, targeting the after-deck house. Every gun that could elevate high enough opened fire. The Val was hit repeatedly. The bomb separated from the aircraft and fell into the water. But the Val itself, still carrying fuel, crashed into the after-deck house between Mount 53 and Mount 54. DiMarco was thrown to the deck by the impact. The explosion killed most of the crew on Mount 54. The ready ammunition for the 5-inch guns started cooking off from the heat. Shells were exploding inside the handling rooms. The fires were out of control. The damage control parties couldn't get close enough to fight them. The heat was too intense. But Mount 53 was still intact. The blast had gone upward and forward. DiMarco's position, just aft of the impact point, was shielded by the deckhouse structure. He got up, checked his crew, and got back on the gun. They kept firing. This is where DiMarco's welding became critical. The explosion that destroyed Mount 54 should have propagated through the deck structure and taken out Mount 53 as well. The two gun mounts were connected by the same structural framework. Standard welding techniques would have meant uniform stress distribution. When one section failed catastrophically, the failure would race through connected structures following the path of least resistance. But DiMarco had welded the deck frames using his irregular pattern. The welds between the two gun mount foundations had slight variations in grain structure, cooling patterns, and penetration depth. When the explosion hit Mount 54, the structural failure started to propagate toward Mount 53. The crack raced through the deck plating at supersonic speed. But when it hit DiMarco's welds, something unexpected happened. The crack encountered boundaries where the metal properties changed. The variations in the weld structure acted like speed bumps for crack propagation. The crack slowed. It changed direction. It dissipated energy. Instead of catastrophic failure that would have torn both mounts off the deck, the damage was contained. Mount 54 was destroyed. Mount 53 remained operational. Nobody realized this in the moment. The crew was too busy fighting to analyze why they were still alive. But that irregular weld pattern, the one DiMarco's supervisors hated, the one that looked sloppy and unprofessional, had just saved the aft gun and its crew. The 7th Kamikaze was inbound at 2:55, a Zero fighter. It came in low from the starboard side, skimming just above the wave tops. The 20mm guns engaged it. They walked their fire across the water toward the approaching aircraft. The Zero took hits across its nose and cockpit. The star canopy shattered. The pilot was probably already dead, but the aircraft kept coming, controlled by momentum and the last inputs from a dead man's hands. The Zero hit the starboard side amidships, right at the waterline. The explosion opened another hole in the hull. The engineering spaces were flooding. The forward engine room was taking water. The engineers were working in waist-deep water, trying to keep the pumps running, trying to keep the engines operating. If they lost propulsion, the Laffey would become a stationary target. She would die. The 8th Kamikaze dove at 2:57. Another Val. This one targeted the after superstructure, trying to finish what the 6th Kamikaze had started. The Val came in steep, diving at nearly 90 degrees. Mount 53 elevated to maximum angle and fired directly up at the diving aircraft. The 5-inch shells caught the Val at 800 feet. The aircraft disintegrated. Pieces rained down on the Laffey. The engine hit the deck, like a meteor, punching through the thin steel plating. The wings separated and tumbled into the water. But the bomb, released in the final seconds before the Val was destroyed, continued falling. It hit the starboard side, punched through the deck without exploding, and lodged in a berthing compartment. The crew had an unexploded 500-pound bomb inside the ship. If it detonated, it would blow the Laffey in half. A damage control party raced to the compartment. They found the bomb wedged between bunks, still hot from friction, the fuse mechanism visible and intact. One sailor, gunner's mate 3rd class, Lawrence Delosky, carefully examined the bomb. The fuse was Japanese Type 99, impact detonated. It should have exploded on impact. The fact that it didn't meant the fuse had malfunctioned or the bomb had hit at an angle that didn't trigger it. Delevsky couldn't defuse it. Nobody on the Laffey had training in Japanese ordnance, but they could move it. Very carefully, Delevsky and 3 other sailors rigged lines around the bomb, lifted it out of the twisted bunk frames, carried it through flooded passageways to the main deck, and threw it overboard. The bomb hit the water and sank. It never exploded. 4 men had just saved the ship. The 9th Kamikaze attacked at 2:59, an Oscar fighter. It came in from dead astern, flying up the Laffey's wake. The aft 20mm guns opened fire. The Oscar was hit repeatedly, but kept coming. It crashed into the stern structure, right where the previous hits had weakened the hull. This should have been the killing blow. The stern was already compromised. Multiple holes, extensive flooding, structural damage. Another hit in the same area should have torn the stern off completely. The Laffey should have lost steering, lost propulsion, and started sinking stern first. But she didn't. The Oscar hit the exact same section where DiMarco had spent 3 weeks welding hull repairs after the Laffey's last action off Iwo Jima. He'd used his irregular technique on every seam. Frame 123, frame 124, frame 125, all the way across the stern structure. Those welds, the ones his supervisor said looked like amateur work, held. The impact crushed outer hull plating. The explosion started more fires, but the internal frame structure, held together by DiMarco's chaotic-looking welds, didn't fail. The stern remained attached to the ship. The rudder still responded. The screws still turned. The Laffey could still maneuver. Part 2. The 10th Kamikaze came in at 3-0-1, a Zero fighter carrying a 250-kilogram bomb under the fuselage. It approached from the port beam, diving at a 45-degree angle. The 40mm guns tracked it, firing in long bursts. The Zero's left wing disintegrated. The aircraft rolled inverted, but the pilot somehow corrected. The Zero was flying upside down, on fire, missing a wing, and still attacking. It crashed into the port side superstructure near the forward stack. The bomb exploded on impact. The blast tore through the galley, the crew's mess, the forward berthing compartments. Fires erupted throughout the midship section. The forward stack was twisted at an angle, leaning to starboard, barely attached. Black smoke poured from the damaged uptakes. Commander Beckton was still on the bridge, still commanding. His face was covered in blood from multiple wounds. His uniform was torn and burned. He'd been knocked down 4 times by explosions, but he refused to leave his post. He kept the sound-powered phone pressed to his ear, listening to damage reports, giving orders, coordinating the defense of his dying ship. The 11th Kamikaze attacked at 3-0-3. Another Val dive bomber. It came in from high altitude, diving through the smoke that was now obscuring the Laffey. Visibility was terrible. The Japanese pilot probably couldn't see his target clearly. He was diving through, black smoke, aiming for where he thought the ship should be. Mount 53 fired blind. DiMarco's crew couldn't see the aircraft through the smoke. They were firing on radar cues from the Combat Information Center. The 5-inch gun elevated, trained, and fired into the smoke. They couldn't see if they hit anything. They just kept loading and firing. The Val emerged from the smoke 200 feet directly above the fantail. It was already mortally hit. 1 engine cylinder was gone. The prop was windmilling. The pilot was slumped forward in the cockpit. The aircraft nosed over and crashed into the water 50 yards astern. The bomb exploded underwater, sending a geyser of water over the fantail, but causing no additional damage. The 12th Kamikaze dove at 3-0-5. An Oscar fighter. This one was different. The pilot was skilled. He came in from the sun, using the glare to mask his approach. He jinked and weaved, making himself a difficult target. The anti-aircraft fire was lighter now. Several gun positions were destroyed. Ammunition was running low. The remaining gunners were exhausted. The Oscar lined up on the bridge. This was a precision attack. The pilot was aiming for the command center, trying to decapitate the Laffey's leadership. At 500 yards, every remaining gun on the ship opened fire. The Oscar took hits, but kept coming. At 200 yards, it was trailing smoke. At 100 yards, pieces were falling off. At 50 yards, it was burning. The Oscar hit the forward superstructure just below the bridge. The impact was so violent it lifted the entire bow out of the water momentarily. The explosion destroyed what remained of the forward fire control equipment. The bridge windows blew inward. Everyone on the bridge was thrown to the deck. Several sailors were blown overboard by the blast. Commander Beckton was unconscious for approximately 30 seconds. When he came to, the bridge was on fire. The deck was covered in broken glass, twisted metal, and blood. He couldn't hear anything except ringing. His sound-powered phone was gone. He grabbed another one from a dead radio man and started giving orders again. The 13th Kamikaze attacked at 3-0-7, a Zero fighter. It came in from the starboard quarter, targeting the aftergun mount. DiMarco's position. Mount 53 was the only 5-inch gun still operational. If the Japanese could take it out, the Laffey would have no main battery left. The Zero dove through murderous fire from the remaining 20mm positions. It was hit dozens of times. The canopy was shattered. The engine cowling was torn away. Coolant was streaming from the engine. Oil was spraying across the windscreen. But the pilot held his dive. At 300 feet, the Zero's engine seized. The propeller stopped turning. The aircraft was gliding now, a powerless glider with hundreds of pounds of explosives and a man committed to dying. DiMarco's gun couldn't depress low, enough to hit it. The Zero was too close, coming in too flat. The 20mm guns were the last line of defense. Seaman First Class Robert Dockery was manning a 20mm gun on the starboard side. He'd been firing almost continuously for 20 minutes. His hands were blistered from the hot gun handles. His shoulders ached from absorbing recoil. Spent casings were piled waist-deep around his position. He aimed at the Zero and held the trigger down. The 20mm rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage. They hit the engine, the cockpit, the fuel tanks. The Zero caught fire. It was 100 feet away. 50 feet. 25 feet. Dockery could see the pilot's face through the shattered canopy. The man was already dead, killed by Dockery's fire, but his body was still in the aircraft, hands still on the controls. The Zero hit the water 10 feet from the Laffey's starboard side. The impact caused the fuel tanks to explode. A fireball erupted across the water. The blast wave rocked the ship. Burning fuel splashed onto the deck, but the Zero had missed. Mount 53 was still operational. The 14th Kamikaze came in at 3:0 to 9, another Val dive bomber. It targeted the midship section, trying to hit the engineering spaces. If the Japanese could knock out the engines, the Laffey was finished. The Val dove through the smoke, emerged at low altitude, and headed straight for the center of the ship. The 40mm guns engaged it. They fired every round they had left. The Val took hits across the wings and fuselage. The bomb separated prematurely and fell into the water. But the Val itself continued forward. It crashed into the port side amidships, right where the 5th Kamikaze had hit 6 minutes earlier. The explosion widened the existing hole in the hull. More flooding. The list to port increased. The Laffey was down by the stern, listing to port, on fire from bow to stern, and still under attack. Every man still alive was either manning a gun, fighting fires, or working pumps. There was no reserve. There were no fresh crews. Everyone was at the edge of physical collapse. The 15th Kamikaze attacked at 3:11, an Oscar fighter. It came in from the port bow, low and fast. The forward 20mm guns engaged it. The Oscar took hits, but didn't slow. It crashed into the port side forward, hitting near the same spot where the 2nd Kamikaze had hit 18 minutes earlier. The impact buckled the forward deck. The explosion started fires in the forward magazine. The space that Commander Beckton had ordered flooded earlier. The water in the magazine prevented the ammunition from cooking off, but the fires were spreading through the overhead into the crew's berthing spaces. Men were trapped in forward compartments, cut off by fire and flooding. Some escaped through hatches. Others didn't. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 16th Kamikaze dove at 3:13, a Zero fighter carrying a bomb. It came straight down from 8,000 feet. Mount 53 fired at maximum elevation. DiMarco's crew had been firing for 25 minutes straight. They were operating on muscle memory and adrenaline. The gun loader, Seaman Second Class James Thompson, had burns on both hands from touching hot shell casings. He kept loading. The 5-inch shells reached the Zero at 4,000 feet. One shell exploded close enough to damage the aircraft's tail section. The Zero's dive became unstable. It started tumbling. The bomb released early, fell wide, and exploded in the water 200 yards away. The Zero itself crashed into the water 50 yards off the starboard bow. No additional damage to the Laffey, but there were more aircraft inbound. The 17th Kamikaze came in at 3:15, another Val dive bomber. This one attacked from astern, flying, low over the water, using the Laffey's own smoke as concealment. The aft lookouts didn't see it until it was 300 yards away. The after 20mm guns opened fire. The Val took hits, but kept coming. It crashed into the stern at the waterline, exactly where the 1st, 3rd, and 9th Kamikazes had already hit. This was the 4th major impact in the same structural section. The stern was being systematically destroyed. The outer hull was shredded. Internal compartments were flooded. The after steering compartment was taking water. But the frame structure, connected by those irregular welds DiMarco had laid, continued to hold. In any other destroyer, the stern would have separated from the ship by now. The concentration of damage was too severe. The structural integrity should have failed. But DiMarco's welding technique, the one that looked unprofessional, the one his supervisors had written him up for, was distributing the stress in ways that prevented catastrophic failure. The welds were absorbing energy, redirecting forces, preventing crack propagation. The stern remained attached. The 18th Kamikaze attacked at 3:17, an Oscar fighter. It came in from the starboard beam, aiming for the midship section. The remaining 40mm guns engaged it. The Oscar was hit repeatedly. It caught fire. The pilot turned toward the Laffey, trying to crash into the ship even as his aircraft disintegrated around him. At 100 feet, the Oscar's fuel tank exploded. The aircraft broke apart in mid-air. The engine continued forward and hit the starboard side amidships. The impact punched a hole through the thin hull plating, but caused minimal damage compared to a full aircraft impact. The wings and fuselage fell into the water. Another Kamikaze defeated, but the attacks continued. The 19th Kamikaze dove at 3:19, a Zero fighter. It came in high and fast, diving vertically toward the bridge. This was another attempt to kill. The command staff. Mount 53 elevated to maximum angle and fired. The 5-inch shells caught the Zero at 1,500 feet. The aircraft exploded in mid-air. Burning debris rained down on the forward deck. The main wreckage fell into the water. Commander Beckton was still alive, still commanding. The 20th Kamikaze attacked at 3:21. Another Val dive bomber. It approached from the port quarter, diving at a steep angle. The few remaining operational guns engaged it. The Val took hits across the wings. The left wing folded back against the fuselage. The aircraft went into a spin. It crashed into the water 100 yards from the ship. The bomb exploded underwater, sending a waterspout high into the air, but causing no additional damage to the Laffey. 20 kamikazes, 20 attacks in 33 minutes. The Laffey was still afloat, barely. She was on fire from bow to stern. She had 7 major holes in her hull. She was flooded in multiple compartments. She was listing 9 degrees to port. She was down by the stern. 31 men were dead, 72 were wounded. But she was still moving, still fighting. The 21st Kamikaze came in at 3:22, an Oscar fighter. This was the last one. Intelligence would later confirm that the Japanese had thrown 22 aircraft at the Laffey. 21 had attacked. 1 had turned back with mechanical problems. This was the final assault. The Oscar came in from the starboard side, low over the water. Every gun still capable of firing opened up. The 20mm, the few remaining 40mm, even rifles and pistols from sailors on deck. Everything that could shoot was shooting. The Oscar took hits across the fuselage and cockpit. The canopy shattered. The pilot was hit multiple times, but the aircraft kept coming. At 50 feet, the Oscar was burning. At 25 feet, it was disintegrating. At 10 feet, it was barely recognizable as an aircraft. But it had momentum. It hit the starboard side amidships, crashed through the thin hull plating, and exploded in a berthing compartment. The blast killed 3 more sailors, started more fires, opened another hole, but the Laffey absorbed it. She took the hit and stayed afloat. At 3:24, the attacks stopped. The sky was empty. No more aircraft. The radar showed nothing inbound. The Laffey had survived. Against impossible odds, against an enemy that couldn't be deterred, against 22 separate attacks in 36 minutes, the ship was still afloat. Commander Beckton surveyed his ship from the ruined bridge. Every vertical surface was damaged. The forward superstructure looked like it had been through a shredder. The masts were twisted. The stacks were perforated. The deck was covered in debris, shell casings, blood. Fires were burning in 6 locations. Water was pouring through 7 major hull breaches. 31 men were dead. 72 were wounded. The Laffey was dying, but she wasn't dead yet. The engines were still running. The steering still responded. The pumps were still fighting the flooding, and help was coming. The destroyer USS Macomb was racing toward them. So was USS O'Brien. Combat air patrol fighters from the fleet carriers were overhead now, too late to stop the attack, but ready to drive off any additional Japanese aircraft. The damage control parties fought the fires through the afternoon. They sealed compartments. They shored up bulkheads. They welded patches over holes. The pumps ran continuously, slowly winning the battle against the flooding. The list gradually decreased. The stern came up slightly. The Laffey stabilized. At 5:30, the fires were under control. The flooding was contained. The ship was no longer in danger of sinking. USS Macomb came alongside and transferred medical personnel and damage control equipment. The wounded were treated. The dead were prepared for burial. The crew that remained worked through the calm night, repairing what could be repaired, securing what couldn't. The next morning, April 12th, the fleet tug USS Pacana took the Laffey under tow. The destroyer couldn't make more than 5 knots on her own power. The tow was slow, cautious. They had to navigate through waters still patrolled by Japanese submarines and aircraft. But they made it. The Laffey reached Hagushi anchorage off Okinawa on April 14th. She stayed there for a week while emergency repairs were made. Then she was towed to Saipan, then to Pearl Harbor, finally to Seattle. The voyage took weeks. The entire time, the crew worked on repairs, keeping the ship afloat, keeping her moving. The Laffey reached Seattle on May 24, 1945. She'd been hit by 6 kamikazes. 4 had missed or been shot down close enough to cause damage from debris. She'd been bombed, strafed, and set on fire multiple times, but she'd survived. The Navy Yard at Seattle began a detailed damage assessment. Engineers examined every structural member, every weld, every frame. They were trying to understand how the Laffey had survived damage that should have sunk her. What they found surprised them. The structural failures were contained. When one section was destroyed, the damage didn't propagate through adjacent sections. The welds between critical structural members showed unusual characteristics: irregular grain structure, varying penetration depth, non-uniform cooling patterns. They looked unprofessional, but they'd performed better than textbook welds would have. The engineers focused on the stern section. 4 major impacts in the same area should have caused catastrophic structural failure. The stern should have separated, but it hadn't. The frame welds had absorbed incredible stress without failing completely. The engineers traced the welds back through maintenance records. They found the name of the welder, Machinist's mate 2nd class Anthony DiMarco. DiMarco was called in for questioning. He was asked about his welding technique. He explained his approach. The Navy engineers were initially skeptical. DiMarco's method violated standard procedures, but the results were undeniable. His welds had held when they shouldn't have. The engineers started testing. They took samples of DiMarco's welds. They examined the microstructure under microscopes. They tested tensile strength, impact resistance, fatigue characteristics. What they found was revolutionary. DiMarco's irregular technique created what modern metallurgists call a gradient microstructure. Instead of uniform metal properties throughout the weld, there were variations. These variations acted as crack arresters. When stress caused a crack to form, it would propagate until it hit a boundary where the metal properties changed. The crack would slow or stop. This prevented catastrophic failure. The Navy didn't fully understand the metallurgical theory in 1945. The science of fracture mechanics was still developing. But they understood the practical result. DiMarco's welds were tougher than standard welds under extreme impact conditions. They might not look as good, they might not meet visual inspection standards, but they saved ships. In June of 1945, The Navy issued Technical Bulletin Bu Ships TB 543. The bulletin documented a modified welding procedure for destroyer construction. It incorporated elements of DiMarco's technique: the irregular torch angle, the varied travel speed, the controlled, uneven cooling. The bulletin was distributed to every Navy shipyard. It became standard procedure for welding critical structural members on destroyers and destroyer escorts. DiMarco was promoted to Machinist's Mate First Class. He was awarded the Navy Commendation Medal for his welding work on the Laffey. The citation mentioned his technical innovation under combat conditions. It didn't mention that his supervisors had written him up 3 times for sloppy work. The Laffey never returned to combat. The repairs took months. By the time she was ready for service, the war was over. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The Laffey was decommissioned in 1947. She was mothballed with the reserve fleet. But her story wasn't over. In 1962, the Laffey was donated to the Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. She became a museum ship, permanently moored, open to the public. Visitors could walk her decks, see the damage from the Kamikazes, learn about the battle off Okinawa. The museum preserved the ship exactly as she appeared at the end of the war. The patches welded over kamikaze holes were still visible. The twisted mast was left in place. The damage to the superstructure was documented and preserved. The Laffey became a memorial to the destroyer sailors who fought and died in the Pacific War. DiMarco visited the Laffey once in 1978. He was 66 years old, retired from the Navy, working as a welding instructor at a community college in Philadelphia. He walked the deck with a museum curator, pointing out the spots where he'd worked. Frame 123, Frame 124. Mount 53's foundation. The curator asked him about his welding technique. DiMarco explained it the same way he'd explained it to Navy engineers 33 years earlier. You vary the heat, you change the angle, you let it cool unevenly in certain patterns. It looks messy, but the metal is stronger where it needs to be. The curator asked if he knew he was saving lives when he was welding. DiMarco shook his head. He said he was just trying to do the job right. His way. Commander Frederick Beckton survived the battle. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions, commanding the Laffey under sustained attack. He continued serving in the Navy, eventually retiring as a rear admiral. He died in 2000, aged 95. He gave numerous interviews about the battle off Okinawa. He always credited his crew. He said they were the toughest sailors he ever commanded. They wouldn't quit. They couldn't be stopped. Beckton was asked once why the Laffey survived when so many other destroyers sank. He said it was luck, divine providence, the Japanese bombs that didn't explode, the kamikazes that missed by feet, the damage control parties who worked miracles. But he also mentioned the ship herself. He said the Laffey was tough, built right, welded right. She could take punishment that would sink other ships. The Battle of Okinawa lasted 82 days. It was the bloodiest campaign in the Pacific War. Over 12,000 American servicemen died, 38,000 were wounded. At sea, the Navy lost 36 ships sunk and 368 damaged. Most of the losses were from kamikaze attacks. The Japanese flew over 1,900 kamikaze missions during the battle. They sank, more Allied ships than in any other operation of the war. The radar picket destroyers bore the disproportionate share of the attacks. They were the first ships the kamikazes encountered. They were alone, exposed, easy targets. 15 radar picket destroyers were sunk or damaged beyond repair during the Okinawa campaign. The Laffey was one of the few that survived. The kamikaze tactic was brutally effective in terms of exchange ratio. One Japanese aircraft, one partially trained pilot, could sink a ship carrying 300 sailors and costing millions of dollars. The mathematics favored the Japanese. But the tactic had a critical weakness. It required the pilot to die, and Japan was running out of pilots willing to die. By late 1945, volunteers were harder to find. Some kamikaze pilots were essentially conscripted. They didn't want to die. They wanted to live. That hesitation, that human desire for survival, reduced effectiveness. The American response to kamikazes evolved. Better combat air patrol coverage, more anti-aircraft guns on every ship, improved radar warning, better damage control procedures. Ships learned to survive. The Laffey was part of that learning process. Every ship that was hit and survived taught the Navy something about how to build ships that could absorb punishment. DiMarco's welding technique was one piece of that puzzle. Not the only piece, not even the most important piece tactically, but significant. The fact that a destroyer could take 6 kamikaze hits and survive to be repaired meant something. It meant American industrial capacity could absorb losses and rebuild. It meant American shipyards could produce vessels tough enough to survive the worst the enemy could throw at them. The Japanese understood this. They knew they couldn't win a war of attrition against American production. They hoped to inflict enough casualties to force a negotiated peace. The kamikazes were a weapon of desperation. They caused terrible damage. They killed thousands of sailors. But they didn't break American will. Ships like the Laffey proved that. In 2019, a team of researchers from MIT studied the Laffey's structural preservation. They used modern non-destructive testing equipment to examine the welds DiMarco had made 74 years earlier. They found his irregular technique had created what they called a bimodal grain distribution, large grains interspersed with regions of fine grains. This structure provided both strength and toughness. It was exactly what modern aerospace welding specifications tried to achieve. The researchers published a paper in the Journal of Materials Engineering. They credited an unknown Navy welder with pioneering techniques that wouldn't be formally understood until decades later. They didn't know DiMarco's name. The museum records from his 1978 visit had been lost, but they knew someone had done something extraordinary. Someone had figured out how to make welds tougher without understanding the underlying metallurgy. They'd done it through observation, experimentation, and practical experience. That was the American advantage in World War II. Not just industrial capacity, not just technological superiority, but the ability of ordinary people to solve problems creatively. He was a machinist's mate who learned welding from his father, but he observed, he experimented, he improved on the standard technique, and when the moment came, when his ship needed his welds to hold under impossible stress, they held. The Laffey is still in Charleston. She's been there for 63 years. She's slowly deteriorating. Salt air and time are doing what kamikazes couldn't. The Navy and the museum are working to preserve her, but eventually she'll decay beyond repair. Metal doesn't last forever. But the lessons she represents endure. The courage of her crew, the leadership of Commander Beckton, the innovative thinking of sailors like DiMarco. These things don't corrode. They don't rust. They remain as examples of what ordinary people can accomplish when circumstances demand everything they have. DiMarco died in 1994. He was 82. He'd lived a quiet life after the Navy. He taught welding. He raised a family. He didn't talk much about the war. His students knew he'd served. They knew he'd been on a destroyer that was hit by kamikazes. But he never claimed to be special. He always said he just did his job. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer was 3 paragraphs. It mentioned his Navy service. It listed his survivors. It gave the funeral details. It didn't mention that his welding technique had been incorporated into Navy technical bulletins. It didn't mention that he'd saved lives. It didn't mention that researchers decades later would study his work and find it ahead of its time. DiMarco wouldn't have wanted those things mentioned. He was a welder. He did his job. That's how he saw himself. The fact that his job involved keeping ships afloat while under attack by suicide bombers was just a detail. The fact that his unorthodox technique proved superior to standard methods was just how things worked out. He didn't claim credit. He didn't seek recognition. He just did the work. That was the character of the men who won the war. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as people doing necessary work, sailors manning guns, engineers keeping engines running, welders laying beads, each person doing their small part. Together, those small parts added up to victory. The Laffey survived because of hundreds of individual decisions made by her crew. Commander Beckton's decision to stay on the burning bridge, Gunner's mate Delosky's decision to move the unexploded bomb, Seaman Dockery's decision to keep firing at the Zero until it crashed, and DiMarco's decision, made months earlier in a shipyard, to weld his way instead of the Navy way. None of them knew their individual actions would be decisive. They just knew what needed to be done, and did it. That's the real lesson of the Laffey's survival. Not that innovation matters, though it does. Not that courage matters, though it does. But that ordinary people making ordinary decisions can achieve extraordinary results when they refuse to quit. The mathematics said the Laffey should have sunk. 6 kamikaze hits, 4 near misses causing significant damage, fires, flooding, structural damage. Any one of dozens of factors should have been fatal. But the crew kept fighting, the structure kept holding, the ship kept moving, and in the end, the Laffey survived because her people and her structure were both just tough enough to absorb what the enemy threw at them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.